all of the students. Our topic or the name of chapter is transpiration, and in this chapter we are learn about the definition of transpiration. What is meant by definition of transpiration? Transpiration is nothing but the loss of water in the vapor form or gaseous form from the aerial part of the plant, that is known as the transpiration. Further, we are learn about the different type of transpiration, that is nothing but the cuticular, lenticular and stomatal transpiration. Then pathway of stomatal transpiration, what is the structure of stomata, mechanism of closing and opening of the stomata. Mechanism of opening and closing of stomata we learn in the last chapter, but in this chapter we are learn about one hypothesis, that is known as the Stewards hypothesis. This hypothesis is mainly described by the Steward in 1964. What he described? He proposed the hypothesis to explain the mechanism of opening and closing of stomata, and according to him, the conversion of starch and inorganic phosphate, that is nothing but the PO4, and it is also write in the form of P, capital Pi, small I, into glucose. What is say? The conversion of starch and inorganic phosphate is converted into glucose 1-phosphate, but that glucose 1-phosphate does not cause any change in the osmotic pressure of the guard cell. And if there is no change in the osmotic pressure of guard cell, at that time there is no endosmosis, and if no endosmosis, then stomata does not open, because the inorganic phosphate and glucose 1-phosphate they are equally active osmotically. What he say? He says that glucose 1-phosphate should be further converted into the glucose. Glucose is a pure form, and in that pure form, when glucose 1-phosphate is converted, at that time only the opening of stomata takes place, and it takes place during the daytime. Whereas metabolic energy in the form of ATP would be required for the closing of the stomata, and this energy comes from the respiration process. And at the same time, the pH is also required, and that pH is high for opening of the stomata, and that will take place in the following manner. Let us see what is present in the guard cell, that is nothing but the starch plus inorganic phosphate. Okay, this is present into the guard cell. It is present into the guard cell. When starch is present, stomata is closed. Okay. Further, that starch is converted into glucose 1-phosphate. But till here, stomata is closed. And for that purpose, for the opening of the stomata, this glucose 1-phosphate is further converted into the glucose. Okay. But here in this process, starch plus inorganic phosphate converted into glucose 1-phosphate, and that process required a enzyme, and that enzyme is known as the phosphorylase. Okay, starch is converted into glucose 1-phosphate in presence of enzyme, that is the phosphorylase enzyme. But at the same time, pH plays an important role, and what pH requires? pH is equal to 7, that means the neutral pH. Okay. Further, this glucose 1-phosphate is converted into glucose 6-phosphate. Okay. this is the further conversion of glucose 1-phosphate into the glucose 6-phosphate, but for this process also a enzyme is required. That enzyme is phosphoglucomutase. Here mutase, phosphoglucomutase enzyme is required. Okay. Further, here two compound can be present here, and that compounds are nothing but the first one is glucose. Okay. Further, they are converted into the glucose, and another compound, that is the inorganic phosphate. From starch, inorganic phosphate is separated and glucose is separated here. And when the starch is converted into the glucose, at that time stomata open. Okay. In this way, from starch, here daytime is there. What? Daytime. In daytime, this whole process is carried out. Further, what process takes place? As Stewards says that this glucose is further converted into the starch, but when in the process of respiration is there. So this glucose is further converted into the glucose 1-phosphate when respiration is there. For respiration, what requires? Oxygen is required. Okay. And also some energy is required, and that energy is in the form of ATP. Okay. ATP in energy is converted into the ADP. Here energy is required. Adenosine triphosphate is converted into the adenosine diphosphate. That means triphosphate and diphosphate. That means one phosphate group is added for the formation of glucose 1-phosphate. So here is the 1. 1 means the one phosphate group, and that one phosphate come from the ATP. Okay. And when respiration is takes there, at the time of respiration only energy can be used. This O2 and O2 further used here. But at the same time some enzyme is required here, and that enzyme is nothing but the hexokinase. Hexokinase enzyme is required here. In this way, glucose is further converted into the glucose 1-phosphate. Further, this glucose 1-phosphate again converted into the starch and inorganic phosphate. But when there is pH equal to 5, that means acidic pH is required for this process, and some enzyme is required, and that enzyme is again phosphorylase. This enzyme is same, phosphorylase enzyme. Okay. In this way, this glucose is again converted into the starch. When starch is present into the guard cell, at that time osmotic pressure of guard cell is less, and due to the less osmotic pressure, guard cell or stomata become closed. When starch is converted into the glucose is dissolved into the liquid which is present into the guard cell. Due to that, the concentration of the guard cell is increases. Due to that, the osmotic pressure of guard cell is increases, and at that time stomata is open. Okay. And here stomata is closed here when starch is there. In this way, opening and closing of the stomata is represented by the steward. Okay. This is the two processes are there. I hope you are understand these processes. Thank you. Thank you very much.